Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Erin Teggy. I'm the Prevention Director at Peer Services, and I help co-lead the Glenview Northbrook Coalition for Youth, GNCY for short. GNCY is a local substance use prevention coalition dedicated to empowering youth in Glenview and Northbrook to live safe and drug and alcohol-free lives through school, community, and family partnership. So we are so grateful to have Dr. Aaron Weiner here again today. He provided a wonderful webinar last month, which is recorded. If anyone missed it, we're happy to share that with anyone who wants to view it. And we're so excited to have him back again today to really focus on cannabis, THC, and our youth, their health, well-being, mental health, etc. This webinar will be recorded, and we will share the recording and slides with participants probably realistically next week. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Weiner so he can get things going for us.
All right, thank you. I'm the other Aaron of the day. A great name, Aaron. I like your name. And hello, everybody, and welcome this afternoon. Glad to be back again. This is the Empire Strikes Back version of our trilogy. So we're here on day 2, and we're going to be talking here. I'll pull up my slides about cannabis, THC, and teen health. And so what we'll go through today, there will be a little bit of overlap for those who were here for part 1, but hopefully still a lot of new information for those who were here last time as well. We're going to go a lot deeper into it. If you have any questions as we go along today, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We should have time at the end. And if by some chance we don't have time, please just drop me a line. I'm here at aaron@weinerphd.com. And you are, hold on. I gotta actually have to get my slides up and keep them up here. Feel free to drop me a line, and I'll be happy to answer them. But with that, we got quite a bit to go through today, so I'm just going to try to dive in and get things rolling with the basics of what is cannabis and defining some terms, because I think that sometimes this gets confused because there's a few different terms that get thrown around a bit. Cannabis itself, it's a plant category with multiple plants. Cannabis plants have over 500 chemical compounds, 100 different cannabinoids. The 2 cannabinoids that we talk the most about are THC, or delta-9 THC in particular. That's the one that comes from marijuana plants. More on that term in a second. And then CBD, or cannabidiol, which is, we're not going to talk about CBD too much today, outside of how it's being chemically altered, but it's basically like an anti-inflammatory if it's just, say, consumed, if it's eaten. It has some anti-inflammatory characteristics. It's not it's not psychoactive, though. It's not going to get you high. It's not addictive. Now, those are the cannabinoids we hear the most about. In terms of the plant categories, there's 2. Marijuana is a cannabis plant that has high levels of THC and low CBD. Hemp plants have low THC and high CBD. And the cutoff for this is 0.3%, which is actually very low. 0.3% THC by volume. Anything over 0.3% THC is a hemp plant. Anything over 0.3% THC is a marijuana plant. And this distinction matters a lot because marijuana is federally illegal. Here in Illinois, we have a recreational market, we have a medical market, so you can get it from dispensaries. Hemp, you can get anywhere. Hemp-based products, because as of 2019, the Farm Bill allowed for hemp to be sold everywhere. How that and why that matters a lot, though, and we'll talk about this towards the end of the presentation today, is that hemp products are being chemically altered to be psychoactive. You can actually, in fact, make delta-9 THC, the same active ingredient in marijuana. You can make that from hemp, but if you make it from hemp, you can then sell it out of a gas station, which is, or a bakery, or a cafe, and that's what we're seeing across Illinois right now because we don't actually regulate that at all. But those are the terms. So cannabis, I probably won't say cannabis too much today because that again is an umbrella term and refers to a lot of different things. I'll be talking predominantly about marijuana, and I'll be talking about THC. So all right, just did it again. Sorry guys, gotta keep my slides up today. Technical malfunctioning. I get the next slide to pop up too. All right, there we go. So THC, it binds to CB1 receptors in the brain, which is why it does what it does to us. So we have what's called an endogenous cannabinoid system, where we have cannabinoids in our body and receptors in our brain and body to receive these signals, which is why the plant affects us, much like we have opioid receptors in our body, which is why opioids influence us. And if you look at where the concentrations of these receptors are in the brain, you can see why the chemical does what it does to us. You can see the movement impairment from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Cerebral cortex is where you get the impairment of the higher cognitive functions. You've got the hypothalamus for appetite stimulation, the medulla, which is where you get the vomiting suppression, hippocampus for suppression of learning, memory, and stress, and then some pain-sparing effects out of the spinal cord. So that one, actually, we're not going to go too far into the medical side of things today, or the therapeutic side of things today. But pain sparing actually is not quite as much of a slam dunk as it's made out to be. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not, but it certainly can be at times, and this is why. But we've got those receptors in the spinal cord. So it is, however, though, the most used recreational substance behind alcohol and tobacco in the country. And there's a number of routes of ways that people can take it in. For smoking, you can smoke it in a joint or in a blunt. Blunts are rolled in cigar paper, tobacco paper. You can also smoke it through a bong where it's filtered up through water. But the delivery system that's becoming much more popular with youth right now is vaping. And part of what's challenging about this is that what you vape when you vape THC products are concentrates, not necessarily, generally not the flower. You know, the flower can be vaped in certain vape devices, but it's not what's normally vaped by youth. The issue is that this is actually the most harmful formulation to the developing brain. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. And we now have a delivery system that's very convenient. How you used to have to consume concentrates was with a modified bong through something called a nail, where you have you can see that the concentrate down there at the junction down there. That's the orange bit right there. And then you heat it up with a butane torch. That's the thing coming in from the side. And that's just a lot more cumbersome, obviously, than this, right? Than just using a vape pen. And so it's really facilitated a lot of, again, the worst medical outcomes of the product. And then you have edibles, and we'll swing back on this again in a little bit. But you know, depending on where you're buying it from and the type of THC you're looking at, there are they riff on existing products, copyright infringement. Sometimes they're just infused into candies and cakes and things. But there's the issue then, of course, also of marketing. And that a lot of times it seems like, you know, how they're marketed isn't necessarily at, you know, we'll call it 30, 40, 50-year-old customers, right? It tends to angle a little bit more youthful. So we also find that there's this oh my gosh, sorry guys, it seems to keep happening today. I apologize. There seems to be a high variability of concentration as well in these products, and it's increased over time. If you start in the mid-90s and go up until today, you can see that from the samples that the DEA has seized, it's been going up and up and up and up over time. And that's been there, that 95 point there, that 3 to 4%, that's where it was since Woodstock. And it's really only been in the past 20 years that we've seen this increase. And what it's gotten to now is a point where pretty much everything that you buy out of a dispensary is well over 15% THC. This was a study that was done back in 2020 where they were looking at the proportion of the different products that were at different concentration levels. And you can see even back in 2020, or I would say actually it's even more potent now than it was before on average. And we'll actually take a look at that firsthand in a few minutes. But you can see that the green parts of those pie graphs tend to be pretty large, pretty large proportion there. Pretty much everything's over 15%. And what this study found was that in states that just had medical programs, the average potency was 19.2%. And in states with recreational programs like we have, that potency was about 21.5%. And so to put that differently, in today's market here in Illinois, 21.5% on average, that would be like smoking between, we'll call it 6 and 7 joints from the mid-90s at the same time. So it's a lot stronger. It's 6 or 7 times as strong on average. And it actually goes up from there in terms even of the flower, which is what you smoke, and the concentrates. Again, we'll look at this with our own eyes in a little bit. That we're looking at, 60, 70, 80, even 90% pure at times. So a lot of variability there in terms of concentration. It is also absolutely addictive. And this is a myth that THC is not addictive, or that marijuana isn't addictive, that cannabis isn't addictive. That has just been echoing around for a very long time, from everywhere from the halls of high school to literally the halls of Congress. People don't seem to understand that this is addictive, even though it is the second most common substance used recreationally behind alcohol as an intoxicant, and the second most common substance we treat in rehab programs, and has been for a while. We've known for a long time now that there's this very clear, since 2004, this review article showing cannabis withdrawal syndrome. That means physical dependence on THC. This 2014 article found that about 9% of users overall, so all age ranges, so about 1 in 10, but then a higher proportion of kids develop a use disorder if they use, and about 20 to 50% of daily users. What we're finding now, though, is if you look at more recent studies, this number is going up. There's been two now, this is one of them I've got up here, that have found that the rate of people with a cannabis use disorder for non-medical use, you can see it here, it's actually over 20% now. And what we're finding from studies is it sits between 20 and 30% of folks who endorse any amount of cannabis use disorder. So it's moving in a direction where it seems to actually be even more habit forming. Actually, also in the last year, and I don't have the slide up for this, it might not have been I perhaps should have included it. But for the first time, the proportion of people who use THC products say that they use it daily at a greater rate than people who drink alcohol say they use alcohol daily. That's been a recent development. I think the number actually is 40% of people of all age ranges who are using these products say that they use them on a daily basis. So it's definitely something that has become more habit forming as these potencies have increased. Now, today, though, we're talking more about kids. We're talking more about youth. And if you ask teens why they use THC, there are three reasons that come up a lot. The first and foremost, and what we'll be talking about, the frame we'll be using most today, is that they use it to cope. That's what you're looking at here in the top row here, 43%. So that was their reason. They're using it to cope with problems. That's very common. You're dealing with stress, you're dealing with depression or anxiety, social situations that stress you out. It's a way of coping. Second one is social influence. And who's around you and what they're doing. And that is a huge pressure, particularly for young people. We talked a bit about this last week, that if you are, last month, that if you are trying to fit in with a group of people and they are all using substances and you're not, that leaves you very much on the outside looking in. That's not a place that feels particularly good. And so there's that strong pull for teenagers in particular. And then the third one is just enjoyment. They're trying to get high. They want to feel that. The fourth one, if you ask them, is that they feel like they have an addictive personality. But coming back to the idea of coping, and we talked about this in a little bit more depth last month, so I won't go as far into it today. But unhealthy coping comes from discomfort. So when you start to feel really uncomfortable, if you think of mood as being on a continuum from very, very good, very happy to very unhappy. When you start getting to the very unhappy side, that's when you start seeing these compensatory strategies like nervous tics, addictive behavior, eating disorders, self-destructive behavior, isolating. It's people, we're trying to self-regulate. Ultimately, we're trying to find a place of peace. It's just the strategy that people choose might be prioritizing something in the short term over their long-term well-being. And what we're finding as well is that right now, the youth mental health is not in a particularly good place. The more recent data echoes what you're seeing out here, where that about 2 in 5 kids endorses strong feelings of depression. About 1 in 5 is considered attempting suicide in the last year. 1 in 10 attempted it, although only about 1 in 5 made it to a doctor or to a nurse. And so there's this huge burden right now on young people where they're struggling to cope in effective ways, and that leads them potentially towards looking at unhealthy ways of coping. Now we'll talk a little bit about use rates as well, but what's actually interesting is that although there's still a very significant portion of young people who are using these substances, it's held fairly steady over the past few years in a lot of the state. But what we are seeing is them moving towards other unhealthy coping methods as well, and particularly related to technology, which, if I recall, is what we'll be talking about next month in part 3 of our series, I think. Pretty sure that's what part 3 will be about. But for now, let's keep talking about THC, because this is still, when we look at the trends, you've got alcohol, you've got nicotine, and you've got THC around substances, and that's what we're seeing the most of right now. So aside from the fact that it is an addictive substance, it's related to very broad negative functional outcomes as you look forward in a young person's life. So this study here really spoke to me. It's looking at, it's asking folks who are young adults about their THC use when they were adolescents, and then looking at that frequency on a few different levels. And if you draw your eyes over here to the left column, where it's looking at frequent use of THC versus no use, what they found was that the areas where they saw the significant relationship was symptoms of psychosis, and more on that in just a second. That's the top line there. Problematic substance use of any sort. So not just talking about THC, but any type basically of addictive problem or substance use disorder. Having issues with delinquency, having issues with debt, having problems with lower general well-being and feeling socially excluded. And then the one there on the bottom is there's a much greater chance that someone, if they frequently use THC in their teenage years, will, as a young adult, both not be in school or have a job. So again, it's not like this is about risk, right? This is not about saying, like, if you have a young person using THC, that's it, they're done. There's nothing they can do. But it means they are far more likely. They put themselves in a category of youth who tend to have these types of consequences happen to them far more often. So if they're trying to give themselves the best chance, this is not the best way to do it. Now, specifically when you look at academics, we see an impact there both at the high school and collegiate level. At high school, we see lower grades, higher dropout rates, increased school disciplinary problems. And there's a number of reasons potentially for this. One has to do with just cognitively what's going on, and we'll look more at that in a slide coming up in just a minute. But also there's a social side to it. Because if you are frequently using THC products, you're probably doing it with a group of people who are getting high for fun a lot. And that means that they're probably not a group of people who spend the most time studying, right? Or like when they could be at the library studying for the history test, maybe they're getting high in someone's basement instead, right? Or, be in a parking lot somewhere. And so it means that you're self-selecting yourself to be around a group of people and pick up some norms that are less associated with high achievement in high school and in college. We know that the earlier that someone starts, the worse the outcomes tend to be, and the more frequency also tends to lead to worse outcomes. At college, we see the same thing. Folks are less likely to attend and graduate from college, have a lower GPA, and have a longer time to graduate. And this all leads to actually decreased lifetime earning potential. When you look at folks and when we correlate how much THC they've used as teenagers to how much money they make across the course of their life, because there's a culmination of choices and people, it can have this effect that can move you into a different category, or for some people hit that choice point where maybe because they fell into this and their grades dropped, they have certain options closed and other doors are open, but maybe not the doors that would have had the optimal outcomes. It's worth mentioning as well, just about 2 months ago, there was a study that came out, a new updated 2024 meta-analysis, and what they found from that one was that there were that kids who used THC regularly were 39% more likely to have lower grades, 50% less likely to graduate high school as a whole, 28% less likely to go to college, and 31% less likely to graduate from college. So again, not determinism, but when you're talking about risk and the category you put yourself in, it doesn't bode well. It's not a positive influence by any means. Now, I mentioned impact on the brain, and actually, this is not unique to THC. Whenever you put a chemical into the developing brain, you can change both the physical structure of the brain, how it will grow, in permanent ways, as well as functionally how it works. We talked about this last month in terms of alcohol and nicotine, and we touched on this with THC. We're going to go into it a little bit more today with THC, just so you know a little bit more about the specifics, because it absolutely does affect how the brain grows and develops. So on the left side of the slide, what we're looking at here, this is a systematic review and meta-analysis that I think is very enlightening. What they're looking at is the role of cannabinoids in neuroanatomic, let's see, will it stay up? My magnifying glass is malfunctioning today. Sorry, guys. Well, it says, if you can read it, I know it might be small, neuroanatomic alterations in cannabis users. So again, this means neuroanatomic alteration means changes in the structure of the brain. And that top row is looking at the dosage. So how potent the product is and what the implications then are on structural abnormalities. And again, sorry that I can't magnify it, so I'll explain what we're looking at there in the top row in particular. We're looking at the proportion. What we care about there is the proportion of red to blue. The gray is the proportion of studies that didn't look at a particular structure. The red is where they looked at the structure and found a structural difference there by dosage of THC used. And blue is they didn't. So the more red you see in a bar, the more notable that is. So the two that matter most up there, the one second from the left where you see a lot of red to the blue is the hippocampus. That's the part of the brain that's associated with learning and memory. 85% of studies found a structural change to the hippocampus by dosage. In the middle there, the one that with the highest amount of color, that's about half and half, a little bit less red than blue, that's the PFC, or the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain where our executive functions are housed. So that's where our ability to think analytically, put together complex ideas, think about the long-term benefit of something over the short-term gain. That's the prefrontal cortex. 45% of studies found that by dosage, that was related to structural abnormalities. And that is also very relevant because this study's a few years old. I think this one came out in like 2019, and potencies now are even stronger than they were back then, as far as I can tell. When I look around at how much people are using and the intensity of those products. So those are the two brain structures in particular. If you look at that second row down there, this one, we see those same two structures, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Those are the only two where you see that little bit of red. That's looking just at the duration. So that's not looking at the potency of the product. It's just looking at how long they used it. And so there's some findings there in that regard as well. But really, it's about the strength. So again, when we're talking about the concentrates, which are so strong, that's where we're seeing potentially the most damage coming. Now, in terms and functionally of how does this affect cognitive skills over time, this is a study that I think does a good job in displaying it. They're looking at between 7th and 10th grade, 4 different domains of intellectual functioning. This one here, top left, is short-term memory. This is long-term memory. This over here is nonverbal reasoning, and this is your ability to control your behavior, inhibitory control. And in each of those graphs, there's a few different lines. The red line is the most THC use condition. The blue one is the least THC use condition. And you can see that for each of those lines, the red and the blue are on opposite sides of the midpoint. They're as far apart as can be, and wherever the blue line is the better score for that. So like this one, for example, working memory, you want a lower score. That means faster responses, faster recall. So it takes folks longer to do that, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade, if they are using the most THC. So which makes sense, right? That there's going to be cognitive impacts if we are putting a chemical in the brain while it's still developing that can physically change the structure. Like that makes some sense. Again, so the way different chemicals work on that impairment is different. So this is again not unique to THC, but THC absolutely does do this. Brain morphology changes and functional issues with that as well. It, of course, is related to impaired judgment. When you are high, you're not thinking straight, and we've seen that in teens specifically lead to increased risky sexual behavior. And then there's different mental health concerns, including psychotic breaks that are associated with THC use in kids. And again, this increases with the higher percentage of THC. So here we are again talking about the intensity, the strength of these products. So let's start with the question of psychotic breaks. We touched on this very briefly last month, but just to underscore, and for those who weren't here, there are a number of studies that have looked at this linkage between THC, particularly high potency THC use, and the development of psychotic disorders, either having just a single psychotic break or something persistent, which is normally what we think about as schizophrenia, or there's some other psychotic disorders, but that's the one that we talk about the most. What this study found, this was a really seminal study, came out in 2019, was looking at sites all across Europe. What they found was that if you are using today's high potency smoked products, the flower, which is again 6 to 7 times as strong as it used to be on average, at minimum, there's a 50% greater chance that you'll have a psychotic break. The concentrates so like wax, shatter, vaping, etc., that was actually 5 times more likely that you would have a psychotic break than if you weren't using those products. This study was looking at geographic relationships between marijuana policy and these psychotic breaks. And what they did find that your geography matters and that states with recreational programs had more of this. But what really stuck out to me was the number of these that were occurring. So they were looking at the 2017 National Inpatient Sample Database. So they were actually looking at inpatient data. And what they found were that there were 129,000 cases of cannabinoid-induced psychosis in the US in 2017. That was when objectively there were even fewer people using these products than there are right now. So my hunch would this number is even higher now. But this comes down to one person having a psychotic break every 4 minutes in this country due to THC. And this study just came out a couple months ago, actually. This was, I think, extremely relevant and important to take into account. This actually found that your chances of having that psychotic break were over 11 times higher if you are under the age of 20 than if you are over the age of 20. That's what's showing here. This is kind of like an inverse graph where the further you go to the right, actually, the younger the person is, as opposed to the other way around. But they found that 11 times greater chance of having a psychotic episode if you are using these products under the age of 20. So again, so important in particular for teens to understand these risks, because they are the ones who are being affected by this far and away the most. Now, beyond psychotic breaks, we find that there's a very significant connection between THC use and a depression and suicidality and mood in particular. We actually don't see it the same way for anxiety. There are certainly some folks who find that it makes their anxiety worse, but what we really see it in is depression. So here, THC users, it does say cannabis here. I'm going to say THC because, again, we're not actually talking about cannabis here. This is one of my pet peeves. I think we use the word cannabis inappropriately when we're actually talking about something different. So here we're talking about THC, and there was a 37% greater chance of having depression if you were a THC, if you were using THC, and suicidal ideation was up 50%. Now, this study came out in 2019, highly cited. This one really, JAMA Psychiatry went around a lot. It was actually just done, a similar type of review was done again, both in Australia and the United States. So looking at it, not just in US data, they found something very similar. What they found was that it's associated with depression, psychosis, suicide, addiction to THC, cannabis use disorder, dependence, decline in cognitive function, and the development of externalizing behavior. So acting out, essentially, particularly attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Again, they found that its relationship to anxiety was equivocal, so they didn't find anything there. Notably, though, also mental health issues were more prevalent with increased frequency, duration, and intensity of use. So again, we're seeing how much are they using, how often are they using it, that mattered as well. You're welcome. You're welcome to the slides and to read the rest of this is the end of their abstract as well, but I'll stop there. It just really underscores what's been found previously. So again, mental health concerns, they're certainly not made any better. Even if in the short term intoxication can feel good, this is not associated with positive gains for kids. Drugged driving is also a very significant issue with THC, and depending on the sample you're looking at, kids will say they are between 2 and 4 times more likely to either drive high or get in a car with a high driver versus driving drunk or being in a car with a drunk driver. And this is tricky because there's this myth that you just like drive slower and more carefully if you're high, and that is not actually the case. And we'll talk more about specifically what cognitively happens in a second. But in terms of why this is so tough, THC is tricky in a couple ways. The first is that, unlike with alcohol, your blood THC level actually doesn't matter at all in terms of your impairment. Whereas in alcohol, if it's in your blood, that's when it affects you. THC actually shoots out of your blood and into your brain very, very quickly, where it continues to impact you. And the reason why it does that is THC is what's called a lipophilic substance. It's attracted to fat. And your brain is like a big glob of fat. It's 70% fat. So it goes out of your blood into your brain very quickly. Actually, within about 3 hours, or at the top end, You can see here 2 to 3 hours. That's this pink line is the THC concentration in the blood, basically gone. But the subjective high, that's the blue line, that is not descending at the same rate. It's not down to zero. And actually, performance impairment on a motor task, that isn't even going down at the same slope as the high is. That's plateaued actually at the end of 3 hours. And eventually it will continue to come down, of course, but not at the same rate. Things get even trickier with edibles because they don't even kick in until in sometimes about 2 to 3 hours worth of time. So they take longer to kick in than if you're smoking or vaping. So it's easier to misjudge how much have I taken, if I had too much, that sort of thing. Now, in terms of how it actually impacts you cognitively, here's a list of all the different areas where we've seen impairment because of THC use. And all of these are related to different driving tasks in some way, shape, or form. This was from a 2021 review. On the right, you can see these are specific driving related tasks that were tested, and some of them they did not find an effect, generally speaking, but others they did. So again, it's not just that you drive slower and more carefully, it is actively dangerous to do. And these are products that are still being actively marketed to young people. And actually, because we're in a position here where I should, assuming we have no more tech glitches today, we tried everything out before the webinar started. I don't know what happened, but we're going to switch over actually to take a look at a local dispensary, and we'll take a look at what the products actually are. It worked great. And how they're being marketed. And we'll just do that together. And as a quick note, I have not looked at this yet. I have not previewed this. We're going to look together. I just opened it up to this page and this was it. Actually, this is where we're going to start at one of our Rise dispensaries here. I'm first going to make my way through their ironclad age verification to look at the products and get information. So take a look. So even on their homepage, they're talking about using THC to cope. Melt election blues. So they're saying get high to feel better, which makes sense. Here, let's go in Illinois. Let's go. I don't know. Let's go to Mundelein. Let's see what's being sold here. So, all right. Oh wait, actually, this is a lounge. I don't think this is where we want to go. Let's try this again. Let's go back. Dispensaries, Illinois. We'll go to the dispensary. We'll go to the one in Joliet. Okay, so where are our products? Shop our deals. Are we getting in? Oh man, I'm having a hard time. Here we go. Okay, now we're actually at the products here. So here is a 29% flour. Here is a 79% rosin. Here's a 33% flour animal face. Let me make this a little smaller. That might help me actually see things a little bit better here, guys. I wish I could go. This is the downside to doing things together. Usually there's a way to actually just see all of the. Here we go. Let's see all the deals. Will this get us to the menu we're looking for? Maybe not, but still. So here are their deals. We got 29% Black Afghan, 24. Here's 32% Brownie Scout, Carolina Honey, 32, 31, 20. So again, really nothing 3 to 4% here. Go-Gurt, 35%. That's actually amongst the highest that I've seen. 28 Grinch Mint Head Cracker. So again, Head Cracker, who is that really? You can name these things whatever you'd like to name them. So there's a reason why they're marketing it in ways. It's kind of like the same thing with Monster Energy drink, right? Like they've got that tear. Like if you've ever seen that logo, it's tearing through the can, some beast coming through. It's that's not meant to appeal to folks in their 40s, right? That's meant to appeal generally to young folks, and we see the same general thing here. Here's another 34% smoked product. So this is literally if THC products, if marijuana flower in the 60s and 70s was 3 to 4%, this is 10 times as strong. This product is right here. So this is what we're looking at, and this is how it's marketed. And this is part of what's so challenging right now, is that the way these things are marketed and the way these things are sold is not necessarily with health in mind, right? It's generally about money, ultimately, is what's driving it. And this has been very well documented. It's been published on that they use marketing tactics that appeal to kids. A couple of local examples. That at Buffalo Grove Days a couple of years back, the dispensary there was handing out their swag to kids. There was a Zen leaf that was using a badger, a raccoon, excuse me, as its mascot, which is actually illegal anyway, but was made worse because they're literally down the street from Ravinia Elementary School, which has a raccoon as its mascot. I don't know if anyone here saw this billboard. It was on the Jane Addams on the way to O'Hare. I took this picture myself, which is like, I feel like this particular industry is regulated even less than just about anything you can think of to be able to do something like this. And all of this drives perception, right? Kids are soaking this up, but what they're hearing is predominantly positive messaging about actually all drugs, to be honest with you, but THC is one of them. This was a study that was looking at on social media what percentage of what kids are seeing is positive versus negative. And you can see it's about 80% positive is what they're seeing. Versus about 18% negative. So they're constantly being hit with very positive information. And what that's meant is that even while the substance has gotten objectively more and more harmful over time, what you're looking at here is the perceived harm that we believe as a society marijuana has. And this is the different lines are by age. And so you can see all age groups. It's starting in the late 80s and early 90s, which is where the industry really started kicking in even as the product is getting stronger, more potent, and more harmful, people think it is less and less and less harmful. And this is what, by the way, marketing is all about. Because if you were trying to sell this product, it's very important for people not to think that it's dangerous because there's this axiom in the drug world that the more harmful someone thinks your product is, the less likely they are to use it. So this data, what it's showing is that if you have a kid who thinks that there's a great risk to binge drinking, they are half as likely to have binge drank in the last month. And with THC, it's even more dramatic. If they think that smoking marijuana once or twice a week is very risky, they are 15 times less likely to do it. So if you're in the business of selling these products, absolutely, you want to create this, right? You want people to think it's not a big deal because then you've got them in this left bar and not in the right one. So there's an issue there. Now, there's also the issue then of what it portends to over time. And I want to take just a second to talk about what being a gateway drug means, because this is another kind of like the myth that THC isn't addictive. There's this myth that that the gateway effect doesn't exist. And it is a myth. It absolutely does. It just depends on how you define what a gateway drug is. And I want to define that really quickly because I think it's important that we're all have a similar understanding of this. So first, just a couple of bits of data here that I think are relevant. So this is looking at the association between THC use and the chances that a young person will have used another illicit drug in the past month. And you can see that's 10 times as high. Here is a longitudinal study that's looking at the chances that you're going to develop a new addiction to prescription opioids if you are using THC recreationally. And you can see that this is for occasional use versus no use and frequent and very frequent. This is 0.5 to 4.5, so about 8 times as high. Now, this study was looking at that association by the type of product that was used, or what's the chances predictively that they would someone will go on to use another drug. And what they found was that the top category for this was dabbing, so using THC concentrates straight, so not vaping it. Almost 6 times as likely that someone would be using another drug versus if they weren't using THC at all. Edibles was about 3.4 times, vapes was 3.1 times, smoke was 2.57 times, single product used of any sort was 2.34, and more than one product was 3.82 times more likely to use another drug down the line. And this is a longitudinal study that was looking again at opioids in young adult urban cohort. And you can see here on the right side, there's people who low and non-users of THC versus chronic use during adolescence. And this is 7 times as high. So where this comes from, right? And why we see all this data, just piece after piece after piece of data, is that no one actually starts their drug journey with heroin or opiate. I mean, like, just think about it logically, right? Like if you have a kid who's never used a drug before in their life and a friend walks up to them with a syringe and a piece of tubing and heroin is like, hey, you want to go inject heroin with me? And you want to tie off and inject this, they're going to be like, no, absolutely not. What? Like hard, like they cannot imagine themselves doing that. They probably think that's a very risky behavior to do, right? It's nowhere near their identity. Like if something they see themselves, like there's no one says yes to that. No one starts their drug journey with heroin or fentanyl or methamphetamine. Most people don't start with cocaine. What they start with is something they think is more palatable, less risky, easier for them. Like, so, I mean, now imagine that same friend walks up, but it's with a THC vape, right? And like, hey, you want to take a hit on this? Well, what's going through their head then, right? They're thinking, oh, it's like, it's a plant. Lots of kids are doing it. It's natural. Isn't it medicine anyway? All of these tropes that we've heard over and over and over again from the industry that absolutely, if you work with kids, they say these things too. But what happens then if they start using it is a couple of things. One is actually THC and nicotine, those two substances in particular, have been shown to prime the reward system of the brain to be more receptive to the influence of other drugs, meaning you're more likely to develop an addiction to those other drugs as well. So actually, they've primed their brain for that. What they've also done, though, is they've given themselves permission to break the law for fun when they want to, right? Because that's what you're doing if you're under 21, right? You're not. It's not legal to buy it. You're not supposed to possess it. But they've said, I don't care about that. I'm going to give myself permission to break the law for fun when I want to. And what they've also done is they've started hanging out with people who break the law and get high for fun, which means they are far more likely at some point when hanging out with those people to come into contact with a line of cocaine or some pills off the dark web or whatever it is, because they're spending time in situations where those things are more likely to be. And that's how then, like maybe they try some Percocet. And they really like that because opioids produce this intense euphoria, but they also can be very addictive very quickly. And the problem is though that pills that come from pharmacies cost a lot, but pills that are pressed illicitly and bought off the dark web or from dealers, many of which that contain fentanyl actually, those are a lot cheaper because they're less safe because a lot of them have fentanyl in them. And that's why then they start moving into heroin, which is also cheaper than pharmacy pills, and fentanyl, which is even cheaper than heroin because it's easier to buy. But nobody starts with fentanyl or heroin. And so what a gateway drug means is that if you don't take, like if you think about heroin and fentanyl as being like step 4, you're not going to get to step 4 if you don't take step 1 first, and then step 2, and then step 3. And that's what it means. It literally opens a gateway to proceed because there are very few people who are using these really dangerous, intense drugs that did not first start with something that they thought was less risky, that did not start with THC. The percentage is very, very, very high. And that's what a gateway drug means. It's not deterministic. I think that's where people get caught up. They think like, what do you mean? Like, because I smoked a joint, now I'm going to be using cocaine. No, but chances that you ever use cocaine are virtually nothing if you didn't smoke that joint first, right? So take it for what you will, but that's what a gateway drug means. So let's talk now about Delta 8 THC and what this is, because particularly here in Illinois, this is very relevant. So Delta 8 THC products are products that are produced from CBD and hemp. And I mentioned before that this was legalized when the Farm Bill passed in 2019. That's when you started to see CBD products appear all over the place in stores. Hemp became legal, so CBD became legal. However, the thing about CBD is that it is a molecular precursor to a bunch of other psychoactive cannabinoids. And actually, what you're looking at here is the thermal decomposition of CBD. And what you'll see actually is that the primary constituent, the biggest percentage is delta 9 THC. So if you are vaping or smoking CBD, there's a good chance that you would not pass a drug test and you might even get a buzz from it because it decomposes into delta 9 and delta 8 THC. What it means though as well is that you can alter it chemically to create delta 9 THC, delta 8 THC. This here actually was bought from a gas station in Illinois. So you can also then market it in ways. So this completely sidesteps the recreational marijuana system in the state of Illinois because it comes from hemp. So there's nothing there's no guardrails on this. You can market it however you want. You can put whatever you want in there. You can use whatever pesticides you want. There might be mold in there. No one knows. It's not going to be detected. There's no regulation on it at all. Delta 8 is about 50 to 75% as psychoactive as a delta 9 and is made using these toxic chemicals and is completely unregulated. So there's been a lot published on this about how this is one. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing off to you guys because that would be pretty boring, but you can absolutely find impurities in there very regularly that aren't being caught. And this study was actually very interesting on this slide. This was actually done, and here I'll take my head out of the way. This was done here in Illinois. This was done at University of Illinois Chicago by Dr. Jennifer Bash uh, on just products from Illinois that, that, that they bought from Illinois sources, not necessarily dispensaries, right? Because it's coming from hemp. But over here on the left, what you're looking at is that the potency of what was in there didn't match what was on the box. So some of them did, right? 17 to 17, but a lot of them didn't. Some of them had more, like this one. I'm sorry, like this one, where there was over 100 when there's supposed to be 18. Some of them had less. Some of them had nothing in there at all. There's really no consistency. And they also found that there were a lot of cannabinoids in there that were not listed on the outside. So like this one, for example, was supposed to have THCA and it had all of these different cannabinoids in there. And ultimately what they found were that 92% of hemp-based psychoactive THC products in the state of Illinois are mislabeled. 92%. So chances are if you're buying something like this, you are not getting what you think you're getting. You're either getting more or less of certain things and maybe a bunch of compounds you didn't think you were getting in the first place. And that's what the market currently looks like. It is legal here in Illinois. Each session, I feel like there's some bill that tries to regulate this. And actually, what's interesting is that marijuana dispensaries would love this because these people cut into their profits very directly, and they don't have to do any lab testing. They, 92% of their products are mislabeled. Like the dispensary owners went through this whole rigmarole to get authorized, and these guys do nothing. The hemp-based folks do. And you can literally create, here's an example of some other products that are being sold. You can literally create, as I mentioned, Delta 9 THC from hemp and then sell them in like say 500 milligram packages. And in dispensaries, the maximum you can put, here's a 2000 milligram disposable vape. But you can't do this potency. The maximum here in Illinois from dispensaries is 100 milligrams. And I mentioned that the riffs, like here's an example of a direct riff. So on the left are actual Cheetos. On the right are ones, this actually is a bag from California, but they do this here in Illinois as well. The same sort of thing, where this is a THC product that has 600 milligrams in there. So what this marketplace looks like, let's pop back over here to the web browser, this is what it looks like on one online vendor. So this is a Delta 8 resellers. You've got all sorts of, so I went to hemp THC gummies, right? So you've got Ghost Reaper. So they're marketed with all the same names that appeal to youth, but in this case with cartoons, so there can be ghosts on there. There can be designs, there can be whatever you want. And here's a list of all the different products. You've got 6, 8, Delta 9, 10, 11, THCH, JDP. I mean, we really, honestly, if anyone tells you they know what these do to you in terms of intoxication or honestly in terms of safety, it is a lie. We have no real medical data on any of this. So like this is a trip drip that is supposed to have an 8 cannabinoid blend of Delta 8, 9, 11, like all these different things. Is it accurate? Probably not. What does this do? We don't know. This is basically what you're looking at is like designer drug cannabinoids. Like that's what these are. Synthetically produced, shipped to your house, sold out of gas stations. That's what the market looks like. There was a study that came out recently that looked at what is being sold. They actually found, the researchers did, that there are 26 different intoxicating compounds right now that are commonly being sold on these websites. Matt Reisheim, by the way, does amazing research. He does a lot of research in this space. I had him on my podcast most recently, the episode that came out last week. I did an hour-long chat with him. So feel free to check that out if you're interested. The videos on YouTube and the podcast you can access from my website or wherever you like to get podcasts. But he does an excellent job and has published a lot on this topic. Example of a cautionary tale here. So one product that you can still buy, although less commonly now than before, is called THCO acetate. And this is one that actually is about 3 times as strong as regular Delta 9 THC. And the reason for this is that it is acetylized. That's why it's called THCO acetate. When you acetylize a substance, it passes more easily through the blood-brain barrier and hits you harder. So heroin, for example, is acetylized morphine. That's what heroin is. So this is acetylized THC. Now, what the issue is, though, is that, and this was on the market for years before, in 2023, this was published. It published online end of 2022, that it creates ketene when you vape it, which is the same substance, the oily substance that is created when you vape vitamin E acetate, which is what caused EVALI, that lung-based illness, essentially, that vaping-based lung illness that was hospitalizing and killing kids right before COVID hit. It was like late 2019, early 2020, where this was emerging. And they show that it actually, there's a direct link. It is putting that exact same thing into your lungs. And this problem, by the way, is not going away, EVALI. It actually, although we're not talking about it, this study was looking at the number of claims that were filed. And, it's gone up and up and up over time. So it's not going away. Now, what's interesting about this is that I used to, when talking about THCO, show this gentleman's, he's got a YouTube channel called The Strange Show, and he had videos of THCO products that he had reviewed, and I pulled up one of his videos, and I was looking for it about a few months ago to show it to another audience and say, like, because he actually uses it on screen and talks about the high, and I couldn't find it. And so I was searching around his channel and I found this video, and I have to give him credit. Like, a lot of folks in this industry, in this space, in this media space, they don't want to hurt people, right? That's not what they're trying to do. And so I give him a lot of credit for posting this video, but I want to show it to you because I think it's, again, this is what the risk is around these products and using these products before we know entirely what they do. So give me a second here. This should show up, and Aaron or Ann, flag me if we have some sort of audio issue, but I think this will work. We're just going to watch 2 minutes of his show here.
Okay, I have messed up again. A new study has just uncovered some really scary risk about something that I have been vaping and talking about on this channel for a while now. What's up, homie, and welcome back to The Strange Show, the channel where we cover all kinds of cannabis facts, education, news, and reviews. And in this video, we need to talk about some of those reviews, specifically the ones I've done with THCO, because a new study shows that in some cases, it could be very dangerous. So we're gonna cover what this new study says, what that means for us, what this means for other products, and then we're going to look at how you can still use this stuff in a safe way if you know what to do. Plus, we got some free goodies from Mood, so stay tuned for that. So I first made a video about THCO in July of 2021, and I made this video before I had ever even tried it. This was just a video about the history of how THCO was made, because the history of how it actually came to be is really interesting. The US government was trying to create a weapon with cannabis, and while they were trying to do that, this is one of the things they ended up making. It wasn't a successful weapon, but it was still a really interesting story, and if you want to learn more about that, I'll leave a link to that video in the card and in the description of this video. But at first, that was all it was. It was just that video about the history of it. I was sort of hesitant to even try the stuff, but eventually I did try it, and I did talk about it on the channel, and I did a couple of reviews about it. And I actually even just did a video recently where I was like, I was wrong about all of these cannabinoids that I was hesitant about. I thought, well, they've been out for years, everybody's using them, we haven't seen any problems yet, so they're probably safe. But I was very wrong, and I'm very sorry, because this new study is sort of scary. I wish I would have known about this when I made that very first video, and I'm sorry that I've went so long with such wrong information. But until now, we really had no way to know. But now we know.
Now we know, right? And this is, again, I give him a lot of credit for taking that tact and for acknowledging it. And you saw he actually pulled up the same study that we were talking about. But this is the issue, right? And so, like, the vendors, we can, if we leave the media away from a second, we're about to talk about what can we do about this. But if we leave the media of it aside, but even talk about the vendors, all of those compound, those 26 products that are being sold right now, any one of them, something like this could come out at some point. and then people are like, wow, what have we been doing for years? Maybe that's part of why E-Valley has tripled, even when it didn't. We just don't know. It's a huge experiment, honestly, where it's very hard to track because nothing is labeled properly. There are a lot of risks involved when it comes to semi-synthetics. So what can we do? This is the landing spot. What can we do as parents or as adults if we want to try to help guide young people through this very complicated terrain? I want to acknowledge we are 3 minutes from the top of the hour. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go about 5 minutes late, but also go a little bit quickly through the one repeat slide that we have here that we did last time. So if you'd like to hear a little bit more about that slide, I'll tell you more when we get there. Feel free to check out that recording from last month. But what we can do, the first thing that I want to highlight is we have to talk about it. And there's a phrase that was coined, I think, by a local coalition, but I'm not entirely sure, called that 61-minute conversations are far more impactful than one 60-minute conversation about these products. You don't want to have just like one talk, maybe too late, and have to push back against narratives and have it feel like a lecture. Ideally, what you want to do is start talking to young people about the truth about all of this stuff. Because what I found is that a lot of young folks aren't aware of a lot of what we spoke about during our webinar today. Give them all the information, ideally at the front end, right? That they need to know to make informed decisions. Because the bottom line is that you're not going to be there when they make the decision about whether or not to accept THC and to put in their bodies. All we can do is give them the information that they need to know. But if you make it a lecture or you just talk about it once and then not again, they're far less likely to have that information in mind or even to talk to you about it if something comes up. So what this is getting at is that you don't have to make it complicated. You can literally just ask, like, hey, have you seen this at school at all? Is this in your world? Are your friends doing this? Does this come up at parties? Like, what have you seen when it comes to THC, when it comes to weed, when it comes to marijuana? It's worth using the words that young people use. It's a little different in each community where you go. Generally speaking, though, I've found that right now the term that kids are using is weed. Like that's what they're calling it. Sometimes they'll call it marijuana, sometimes they'll call it THC, but really trying to make sure that we're tapped into whatever's being used colloquially. Otherwise, you're just another out of touch parent, if you will. But just start there. It's oftentimes counterproductive to ask, are you doing this? Because that's very confrontational. It's very face threatening. It might be very hard for them to say yes. So instead of asking about what they've seen in their environment is a lot less threatening, or sometimes even asking about friends, they might feel like they're ratting on somebody. So just take it whatever pace feels good, and feels useful and productive, but just make sure you ask and talk about it, or like, hey, did you hear about this, like that sort of thing. So you don't have to make it a big deal, but just make it something that you stay in touch about, that you're up to date about what's going on in their life. So this is the slide that we talked about last time. So for the sake of getting in here and having some time for questions, just happy to stay a little bit late for that too. I'm not going to go too deeply into this one today, but essentially it's really critical for us as parents and adults to be emotionally safe to the kids that we're working with. If we don't show them that we're safe, they're not going to trust us. They're not going to talk with us. And so you demonstrate that safety by communicating with, the acronym is LOVE, by listening, offering, validating, and empathizing with young people. And again, for the sake of time today, I'm going to go quickly through this, but listening means listen actively. Show them that you're listening and that you care. Offer them feedback in a way that allows them autonomy and not just you telling them what to do. Ask permission to share how you feel. It's like literally say, like, hey, do you mind if I share an idea that I think might help? Then you provide the information, then ask them how they feel about it. Like, do you agree, or it's okay to disagree, just to get their opinion. That tends to land a lot better than you being pushy. You can validate someone's underlying emotions, that you get it, why they would do that, without necessarily endorsing the behavior. And letting someone know that they are okay goes a really long way towards creating a strong bond there. And then if you want to be in the hole with someone, if someone's in a dark hole, empathy means getting in there with them, not just telling them what the right thing to do is, and trying to kind of like ride in and save them. Like that's not actually what people want most of the time. And if you don't have this relationship with your son or daughter right now, have persistence about it. Changing someone's feelings about you takes some time, takes some repetitions. So don't give up. Now, that part aside, so you've got to have that foundation. You've got to have the safety, but then where do you get information to give them? Well, certainly, there's a lot we've talked about today that can be useful. If I had to name one resource online, though, that one organization that does an amazing job, where you can get all sorts of infographics like this one, and curricula, and just all sorts of good information that's designed for young people, it's Johnny's Ambassadors. Laura Stack founded this after her son, Johnny, actually, during a cannabis fueled psychotic break, committed suicide. He jumped off of a parking garage. And so she took it upon herself to educate parents and kids about this, because she had no idea that this sort of thing was even possible under the influence of THC. And she's done such an incredible job. And she's written books. She's gone on TV shows. She's made, again, a curriculum for kids around prevention. Highly recommend checking out Johnny's Ambassadors if you're interested in this sort of information. If you have a young person who is currently using and wants to stop, the best tool that I've found that's available to us right now, and unfortunately there's not that many, but this is a good one, is something called Clear 30. So if you go to clear30.org, you can learn up about it. It's actually an app that helps someone just take a 30-day break, is where they started. Just take 30 days off and see where it goes. It's created by a psychologist. It's got great data behind it. So check it out if you're interested. Again, it's the website is clear30.org. Clear 30 is the name of the app. Right now it's just for iPhone though, so it's not available on Android, but again, very useful program. I should mention I'm not affiliated with them in any way. I don't get like a kickback or anything. It's just something that is based on good science. And the last just thought I give to parents around this is to remember that bad behavior, quote unquote, if you have a young person who's using, what we see is the behavior, right? Like using THC products or anything else. But there's a lot, the why behind the behavior matters so much. Is it because they need social acceptance, or they have anxiety, or they feel bad about themselves? We have to go underneath the waterline, is what it's called. We got to get under the surface behind the behavior. We have to know the why if we are going to help someone change that behavior. Otherwise, what I generally find is that substance use is not something that you just punish a child out of. You just don't punish a teenager out of it, because there's a reason why they're doing it. And they're probably just going to try to hide it from you better, or when they go off to college or leave home, they'll just go right back there again when you're not there to stop them. You've got to get underneath the waterline and solve the problem. And whatever resources you need to do that, I encourage you to link up with. Therapy and therapists are a great way to do it. If you have not worked with one before, I prefer Mental Health Match and Therapy Den to find a therapist, because they allow you to filter by what you're really looking for. Psychology Today also can work, but they are basically just like a big everyone's in there. It's like a dump of every possible therapist. So it's not necessarily the best sorted, but there are a lot of resources there too. So to sum everything up from the day to day, THC use has significant risk for teens, particularly if they're using it regularly and with higher potency products. Those risks include addiction, some neurological and cognitive changes, mental health problems, including psychosis, and academic and career outcomes. It just does not project out well for them if they're using. We've got what we'll call it the traditional marijuana and Delta-9 THC route, but now we also have this whole range of hemp and CBD products that are being chemically altered to be intoxicants and are being sold right now with zero regulation or control out of gas stations and just vape shops and everywhere else. So we've got to watch out for that too. As parents, you can talk early and often about THC, what it is and what the risks are. You can cultivate emotional safety with your child so they'll open up to you. You can understand the why behind the behavior and not just the what, so that you can actually get at the real underlying problem there and encourage healthy coping, and know the resources to pull, where to go to get help. So thank you everyone who stayed here to the end. I know I went over by a couple of minutes. I appreciate it. Again, feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions. If you'd like to see that podcast with Dr. Matt Rossheim that just came out last week, you can find again the video on my YouTube channel, or if you go to my website at weinerphd.com, click on podcast, that'll be the first one there on the list. So, all right, with that, let's go back. I gotta find my there's my Zoom. Zoom thing. I'm going to take myself off spotlight mode, and Aaron and Ann, I'll pass it back to you to facilitate the Q&A.
All right. It looks like there was one question from towards the beginning. Why are we still using the word marijuana with its racist origins?
That's a very good question. So it's actually very interesting. I don't have the link handy, but there's actually an op-ed published in the Marijuana Moment about how actually it does not have racist origins. Some people might have used it that way, but it's literally just a word that has an origin from another country. Does not necessarily make it racist. For me, though, the reason why I use it is because it's technically the only word we have for the cannabis product we're referring to. Right now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we have cannabis, we have hemp, and we have marijuana. That's the names for those different plants. If we ever come up with another name that's used or legally recognized to describe that product, I will absolutely consider using that as well. But it's just about, for me, specificity. I think there's also, again, just being honest about it, I think that it's a big marketing push. I think that if you're trying to market a product, if you're trying to say like disconnect it from like a subculture route and get it more into like the mainstream, there's a push to use the word cannabis because there's been a strong push to affiliate that as like a healthcare product. Whereas marijuana, that word isn't associated that way from a marketing perspective, and that's been written about a lot as well. So for that reason as well, I tend to just try to be specific in my language. If I'm talking about THC, I say THC. If I want to talk about cannabis generally, I'll say cannabis. If I want to talk about marijuana or hemp, I'll use the words marijuana or hemp, just because I think being specific is important. To give you an example, and this is a whole nother rabbit hole, when we talk about rescheduling, and what that looks like. When you say we're rescheduling cannabis as a whole, what we're saying then is that THCO acetate, because that's a cannabis product, it's also like saying, like heroin is like a poppy plant product. It's kind of far from the source, but you're basically saying that THCO acetate has therapeutic value and the same risk profile as cannabidiol, which is totally incorrect, or that CBD should be upgraded to be a Schedule 3 substance when right now it's not scheduled at all, and rightly so, right? Because it's not addictive in any way. It doesn't have a risk profile. It's an umbrella term. So I think specificity is important, and we don't have another name for that specific type of cannabis plant, which is why I use it.
Thank you for that response. As of right now, there are no other questions at least in the Q&A box. Not sure if anyone else has any questions.
Yeah, well, if so, fire away. Happy to answer.
All right. How does alcohol compare?
Heather, great question. I wonder if you could be more specific, like in what way? And if you'd like, you can type it, or if you raise your hand, we can actually enable you to use your mic if you'd like to ask that way. While you type, or if you raise your hand, which again you're welcome to do. What I'll say is that so alcohol, it's different. Okay, so Heather, if you want to use your mic, you have to actually, I think you have to raise your hand, or maybe I can do it manually. Let me see. I can do it. Here you go. All right, Heather, you feel free to unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me? This is not Heather. This is her husband, Aaron. I'm another Aaron.
Hi.
Can you hear me
Great
okay?
name, Aaron. I appreciate it. I can hear you. Yeah.
Yes, this is awesome. It's hard to just type this out, but I think I was going back to the cognitive impairment slides. The gateway is one concept, but also I think how it compares to outcomes in youth development with respect to like test scores and let's say dropping out of school, getting jobs that pay, and then also impacts on like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex.
Great question. So last month, if you can pull up that recording, I have a slide actually that looks at both human and rodent models on both the neurological side and the cognitive side. And it goes into, there's actually like a lot of detail that was from a review study that came out about that. So it's it's different, you know, is kind of what I was saying before we got your mic on, is that it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say on like the neurological side better or worse, but it's different, you know, and it does make a difference. We see this for any psychoactive compound. And when the brain is not done developing and you put a chemical in there, it can change the trajectory of how it ends up. And so ideally for the best development, you want to keep chemicals out of it that aren't supposed to be there. In terms of academic outcomes, I actually don't know that off the top of my head, to be perfectly. I'm always happy to say when I don't know something. I do not know that. So I would have to look that one up. I don't know that one specifically how alcohol compares. What I can say though is in terms of the brain priming element of where we see that that folks tend to be more receptive to the positive elements of other drug use and less receptive to the adverse elements. We tend to see that more in nicotine and THC specifically than alcohol. And I could pull up some studies about that if you'd like to try to shoot me an email. But it seems to be those two substances have more of that impact than alcohol does. That being said, I would hazard to say that the same thing would apply. That you know you wouldn't find someone that perhaps alcohol is that step into your like your cocaines or your hallucinogens or your methamphetamines and your press pills or your dark web purchases. It's possible. I think though what we see, you know, I was talking about how when you talk about substance use disorders, there's this psychosocial element to it that is it's not just like a biological thing. You know, there's a psychological and social element to it as well. I think the legality of alcohol, you know, if you are drinking alcohol, it has particularly prior to legalization of THC, um, it had a bit of a different vibe to it because you know you find it in a grocery store versus THC being something that would be like bought on the street, like say from like a drug dealer, or you know, there's different laws that apply. Well, we'll have to see over time if that starts to shift. If, you know, in the most recent election, I think recreational marijuana was voted out in every state that it was on the ballot for. I think like 5 states said no, a couple did medical, but no one did recreational. So I don't know, you know, if it actually is going to end up being something that's done federally or not, if we'd start to see similar trends from, again, that more zeitgeist perspective. But I think that's worth putting out there as a hypothesis as well. That's part of it from a social standpoint, even if you know biologically we don't tend to see the same priming effect. So hopefully that answers your question. Some things I
That
know,
was
other
very
things I
good.
don't,
Thank
but
you.
hopefully that was helpful. Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, there was a question about accessing last month's video, which we will send out when we send out this information. So you'll get it next week. And then there is also a question asking about what is the connection between ADHD and substance use?
Good question. So there's absolutely an association. Um, and the association, I'm not sure. So I want to say I'm not sure if it's bidirectional. What I can say though is so ADHD is a impulse control disorder. You know, essentially it's an executive functioning impulse control concern. And so we tend to see that there's absolutely a correlation between if someone has ADHD, they are more likely to use substances generally. I don't know if THC is any more or less common in that way. So there is that association. I don't know if for many people they would say that it helps them manage their symptoms because theoretically speaking, so ADHD is related to dopamine, generally speaking. It's a dopamine imbalance concern. And so there are some substances that affect dopamine, like specifically, all substances affect it to some extent. But things like amphetamines, for example, like that's why Adderall works, that's why Ritalin works, that directly goes at the dopamine, have a more like proximal aspect to it. But even just in terms of pleasure-seeking behaviors, it's more difficult if you have ADHD to control those impulses than if you don't. So you do see that association. Any other questions? Right. Should we call it, guys?
I think so. Thank you so much.